The road to Black Hollow was long and winding, swallowed by thick forest that pressed in on both sides. The trees loomed tall and bare, their twisted branches scratching at the sky like skeletal fingers. Fog rolled over the dirt path, swallowing the edges of the world, making everything beyond a few feet seem unreal. Elias Crow pulled his coat tighter against the cold and urged his horse forward. He had not been back in 15 years. Black Hollow had always been a place of whispers, a town buried deep in the Appalachian Mountains, hidden from the world, tucked away like a secret no one wanted to remember. Elias had grown up here, but he had spent most of his life trying to forget it. He had left at 18, chasing knowledge, chasing reason. Medicine had given him purpose. Science had given him answers. And yet, none of those things could explain the letter. It had arrived 2 weeks ago, written in his sister's trembling hand. Asterisk Elias, please come home. Something is wrong. People are disappearing. I see things that aren't there. I'm afraid I will be next. Asterisk. The letter had ended abruptly, the ink smudged, as if she had been forced to stop writing. Now, as Elias passed the crooked wooden sign that read "Welcome to Black Hollow," unease settled deep in his chest. The town looked different. Not just older, but emptier. Many of the houses had their shutters drawn, their porches sagging, their doors marked with strange symbols. Carved into the wood, these symbols looked like jagged eyes and twisting lines, like something trying to crawl free. Elias dismounted, tying his horse outside the old general store. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The store was dim, the air thick with the scent of dust and candle wax. Behind the counter, an old man sat in a rocking chair, his head bowed. Elias cleared his throat. "Excuse me." The man's head jerked up. His face was pale and thin, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He looked at Elias for a long moment before shaking his head. "You shouldn't have come back." Elias stiffened. "I'm looking for my sister, Miriam Crow." The man's face twitched, as if Elias had spoken a name that didn't belong. "Miriam," he repeated, his voice distant, uncertain. Elias stepped closer. "She wrote to me. Said people were disappearing." The old man's mouth opened, then closed again. A silence stretched between them, heavy and unnatural. Finally, he said, "I don't know who you're talking about." Elias's hands curled into fists. "That's impossible. She's lived here all her life." The old man swallowed hard. He looked to the door, as if afraid someone might be listening. Then, lowering his voice, he whispered, "You need to leave, doctor, before it's too late." Elias didn't move. His heart pounded. The unease from before tightened into something sharp. He turned and left without another word, stepping back into the cold evening air. The town had grown even quieter. Shadows stretched long across the ground as the sun dipped behind the trees. Elias walked through the streets, searching for a familiar face, but none would meet his eye. The people of Black Hollow moved like ghosts, slipping into their homes, locking their doors. Finally, he reached Miriam's house. The door was unlocked. Inside, dust floated in the slanted light from the windows. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, long gone cold. A chair was overturned. Papers lay scattered across the wooden floor. Elias's stomach clenched. She had been here, but she was gone now. Then, from the hallway, he heard it, a whisper, soft, breathless, calling his name, Elias. His breath caught. He turned, but there was nothing there, just the empty house, and the silence closing in around him. Elias woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window. A thick fog lay over Black Hollow, blurring the world beyond the glass. He sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. His mind felt heavy, like he had been dreaming of something just beyond memory's reach. He dressed quickly and stepped outside. The air smelled of damp earth and something older, something like rusted iron. The town looked the same as it had the day before, yet different in a way he couldn't quite name. It was too still. The street was empty as he made his way to the general store. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. A hunched man stood behind the counter, polishing a lantern. Elias recognized him at once. Thomas Reed, the shopkeeper. "Morning," Elias greeted. Thomas lifted his head, his wrinkled face twisting in confusion. He blinked, as if trying to place Elias. "You're back?" "I am. Looking for my sister, Miriam Crow?" Thomas's expression tightened. His hands stilled on the lantern's glass. "Miriam?" he echoed, like it was a foreign word. "Yes. She sent me a letter. Now she's gone." Thomas wiped his hands on a rag, eyes darting toward the window. "Can't say I remember a Miriam." Elias frowned. "That's impossible. You knew her since she was a child. You used to give her peppermint sticks when we came in." The old man swallowed hard. "Can't help you, doctor." He turned away, suddenly busying himself with a row of jars on the shelf. "Maybe ask someone else." Frustration knotted in Elias's chest. He left without another word. He tried the blacksmith next, then the baker, then the old man who used to sit outside the inn, whittling wood with a slow, steady hand. Each time, the answer was the same. "I don't know Miriam. Can't recall the name. Are you sure she lived here?" Elias's breath grew short. These people had known his family for years. How could they forget so completely? At last, he found himself outside the tiny chapel at the edge of town. Inside, the air smelled of wax and old wood. Preacher Amos stood near the altar, arranging yellowed pages in his worn Bible. The preacher was a thin man, skin stretched over high cheekbones, his silver hair falling past his shoulders. He looked up as Elias entered. "You look troubled," Amos said. "People are pretending my sister never existed." The preacher sighed. "Not pretending," he murmured. Elias stiffened. "What do you mean?" Amos met his gaze, eyes full of something Elias couldn't name. "Names are fragile things, Elias," he said. "A name is what keeps a person anchored. Without it, they slip away." A cold unease settled in Elias's stomach. "This is nonsense," he snapped. Amos tilted his head. "Is it? Tell me, Elias. When was the last time you saw Miriam's face in your mind?" Elias opened his mouth, then closed it. His hands clenched at his sides. He could see her dark hair, her slim hands, the way she used to laugh, quick and bright like a struck bell. But her face, a sharp pain lanced through his skull. Her face was blurred, like a smudged painting. The preacher watched him. "You must find her soon," he said quietly. "Before she's gone for good." Elias staggered out into the fog, heart pounding in his chest. In the street, he saw a man standing near the well. He was tall, motionless, his face turned away. Elias took a step forward. "Sir?" The man's head twisted slightly, as if listening. Elias felt a deep, crawling wrongness settle over him. He wasn't sure why. Then the man took a slow step back, into the mist, and vanished. The morning mist clung to Black Hollow, curling around buildings like ghostly fingers. Elias Crow woke with a dull ache in his skull, a weight pressing on his mind. Something was wrong. He couldn't remember if he had locked his door the night before. He always locked his door. Shaking off the unease, he dressed and stepped outside. The air smelled damp, heavy with the scent of old wood and earth. The townspeople moved sluggishly, their eyes dull, as if weighed down by some unseen burden. He needed answers. At the dusty old chapel, Elias found Preacher Amos, bent over a Bible that hadn't been touched in years. "You don't look well, Doctor," Amos said without lifting his eyes. "I need to know about the mine," Elias said. "And what happened to my sister?" A long silence stretched between them. The old preacher's lips pressed into a thin line. Finally, Amos sighed. "There's an old book, Gideon Holt's journal. If you truly want to understand, find it. But be warned, Doctor. Some knowledge isn't meant for men like you." Elias ignored the warning. He found the journal tucked away in the abandoned general store, covered in dust. The leather binding was cracked, the ink faded, but the words inside sent a chill through his bones. Asterisk, "The deeper we dig, the more we hear them, whispers in the dark. They sound like us, but they aren't us. Something is down here with us, and it's hungry." Asterisk, asterisk, "Jeb is acting strange, staring at the walls for hours, like he's listening. When I called his name, he turned too slow, like he forgot who he was." Asterisk, asterisk, "Men are vanishing. No blood, no screams. Just gone." Asterisk, asterisk, "I saw one today. It looked like Sam Parker, But his face was wrong. Hollow. Empty. It spoke with his voice, but it wasn't him. Asterisk. Elias shut the journal, his breath unsteady. Something had been waiting in that mine, and it had never left. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. The journal's words gnawed at him. He sat by the window, staring into the mist-laden streets. Then he saw it. A figure stood in the road, too still, too silent. Elias squinted, heart pounding. The figure was tall, its shape blurred at the edges, like a smudged painting. It wasn't quite there. Then it turned. Elias's stomach twisted. The face, if it was a face, was wrong. Too smooth, too featureless, yet horribly familiar. It was Jonah Fletcher, the town's blacksmith. But Jonah had vanished last week. Elias's breath came in shallow gasps. He forced himself to look closer. The figure's head tilted, as if studying him. Its mouth opened, and Jonah's voice, thin and stretched, whispered, asterisk doctor. Asterisk. Elias staggered back. His mind screamed at him to shut the curtains, to look away, to pretend he hadn't seen. But when he blinked, the figure was gone. Only the whisper remained, hanging in the cold night air. Asterisk doctor. Asterisk. Elias Crow woke with a start. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. The air smelled of old wood and damp earth. His heartbeat was steady, but something was off. He couldn't tell what at first, just a feeling like a missing step in a staircase. He reached for the matches on the bedside table and struck one. The small flame flickered, casting shaky shadows on the walls. Then his breath caught. The chair in the corner. It had always been empty. He was sure of it. But now, a coat hung over its back, his coat. Had he left it there? He couldn't remember. Elias shook off the unease and dressed quickly. The night had been long, filled with restless dreams of hollow voices and shifting faces. He needed answers. The walk to Preacher Amos's home was cold and silent. A thin mist curled between the houses, wrapping around fences and doorways like ghostly fingers. The town was waking, but it felt emptier than before. Elias knocked twice. The door creaked open almost instantly, as if Amos had been waiting. The old preacher's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he waved Elias inside. "I was expecting you," Amos said. Elias sat across from him at the worn wooden table. The room smelled of candle wax and dust. Shadows flickered against the walls, making the old preacher look even older. "You know what's happening, don't you?" Elias asked. Amos didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a slow, tired breath. Then he began. "This town, it has always carried a weight. Long before the mine, before the roads, before any of us. There are things here that don't belong in the light." Elias frowned. "You're talking about the hollow ones." Amos nodded. "They weren't always like that. They were men once, miners just like your father. But something was waiting for them below. Something that doesn't just take life. It takes you, your name, your memories, yourself. Leaves nothing but a shell." Elias felt his stomach tighten. "And Miriam? Is she still alive?" Amos looked at him, sorrow in his eyes. For now, Elias left the preacher's house with his mind spinning. The wind had picked up, carrying dry leaves along the dirt road. He needed to think, to clear his head. He walked without direction, letting his feet carry him. But something was wrong. The streets looked familiar, yet different. A house where there should have been an alley. A missing sign above the tailor's shop. The world felt misaligned, like a dream that didn't quite fit together. Then he heard it. A voice. At first, it was only a whisper, barely more than the wind. Then it grew. Soft, layered voices, overlapping, speaking in broken fragments. "Elias. Elias, do you remember?" He turned sharply. A figure stood at the end of the road, half hidden by the mist. It looked human. Tall, thin, unmoving. But the details were wrong. The arms were too long. The head tilted slightly like it was listening. Elias squinted, trying to make out its face. But there was no face. Just a smooth, empty shape where one should be. His breath hitched. He stumbled back, heart hammering. The whispers grew louder. "Do you remember?" Then, a flash of movement, another figure appearing beside the first. Then another. And another. A dozen faceless figures standing still, watching him. Elias turned and ran. He didn't stop running until he reached the inn, breathless and shaking. Throwing the door open, he rushed inside. The warmth of the fire did nothing to settle the chill in his bones. The innkeeper, old Tom Wren, looked up from behind the counter. "Doc Crow," he said with a nod. "You all right?" Elias hesitated. His mouth felt dry. "Tom, do you remember Miriam?" Tom frowned. "Miriam?" Elias gripped the edge of the counter. "My sister, Miriam Crow. You've known her since she was a child." Tom's face went blank. A slow, creeping confusion settled into his features. "Crow," he muttered, as if the name was unfamiliar. Elias's blood turned to ice. Tom shook his head. "Sorry, document don't know who you mean." Elias stumbled back. His hands were shaking. She was being erased. And if he wasn't careful, he would be next. Elias Crow stood at the entrance of the old mine, the wind howling through the broken beams like a dying breath. The wooden planks that had once sealed it shut were splintered, as if something inside had clawed its way out. Thick mist curled around his feet, seeping from the darkness below. He gripped the lantern in his shaking hand, its flame barely cutting through the heavy black ahead. His sister was in there. He knew it. He had heard her voice, thin, distant, calling from the depths the night before. He swallowed hard. Every part of him screamed to turn back, but something stronger pulled him forward. Miriam. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. The air inside the mine was thick and stale, pressing against his skin like damp cloth. The wooden beams above creaked under the weight of the mountain. Elias moved slowly, his boots crunching against loose stones. Dust swirled in the lantern's glow, drifting like pale ghosts. Then, a whisper, It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. Many voices. Soft, hushed, speaking over one another, tangled together like roots in the earth. Elias. His breath hitched. He swung the lantern forward, but the light only reached so far before being swallowed by the dark. His pulse pounded in his ears. He told himself it was just the echoes of the old mine, the way sound carried in closed spaces. But the whispers were getting louder, closer. A shape moved ahead. At first, it was nothing more than a smudge against the darkness, like a figure blurred in an old photograph. Then another shape, then two more. They stood between the rotting support beams, still as stone. The light trembled in Elias's hand. The figures had no faces, no eyes, no mouths, just smooth, stretched skin where features should be. Their heads tilted slightly, as if listening. Elias. The voices came from them. But not just one voice. Many they overlapped, speaking in different tones, some high and young, others low and cracked with age. A cold sweat broke out on Elias's neck. The figures didn't move, but he felt them pulling at him, tugging at something deep inside, his thoughts, his name, his self. He clenched his jaw and forced himself forward. Miriam was deeper in, he could feel it. The figures remained still as he passed, but the whispers followed him. Further down, the mine opened into a wide chamber. Rusted mining tools lay scattered, forgotten. A minecart sat half-tilted off the tracks, filled with rotting wooden planks. The lantern's glow stretched farther here, illuminating a figure slumped against the far wall. Elias's breath caught. Miriam! He ran to her, dropping to his knees. She was alive. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. But when he turned her face toward the light, his stomach twisted. She was fading. Half of her face was clear, her eyes, her nose, the sharp curve of her cheekbone. But the other side, it was blurred, smudged like a memory slipping away. Her lips moved, but her voice was faint. "Elias? I'm here," he said quickly, gripping her shoulders. "I'm going to get you out." A low rumble filled the chamber. The lantern flickered. Elias turned his head, and his breath left him. Gideon Holt stood at the edge of the light. Or at least, what used to be Gideon Holt. The thing that had once been a man shifted in and out of focus, its body made of shadows and scraps of lost faces. Dozens of them. A miner's hollow stare. A child's empty smile. A woman's weeping eyes. They flickered across its form, stretching and distorting. It stepped forward, slow, patient. "You don't belong here," Elias said, though his voice came out hoarse. Gideon, or the thing that wore him, tilted its head. Neither do you. Underscore. The voices overlapped, their tones mismatched and broken. Underscore, you are already fading, Elias Crow. They will not remember you. Not your mother. Not your father. Not even you, in the end. Underscore. Elias felt a cold grip tighten around his thoughts. His mind fogged. For a second, he almost forgot why he was here. Then he heard Miriam's weak voice. "Don't listen to them." The fog cleared just enough. Elias gritted his teeth and tightened his grip on his sister. "I'm taking her back. Underscore, she is already one of us. Underscore." Elias looked at her again, at the parts of her that had already been taken. He didn't know how much time she had left. He turned back to the thing in front of him. There was only one way out. Elias grabbed the lantern and swung it, shattering the glass against the minecart's rusted wheels. Fire leapt up the old wooden planks, crawling hungrily across the debris. The flames reflected in the hollow ones' empty faces. They screamed, not in pain, not in fear, in rage. The whispers turned to shrieks, twisting the air around him. The figures blurred, shifting in and out of sight. Elias didn't wait to see what they would do next. He threw Miriam over his shoulder and ran. The fire spread fast, licking up the old beams. The mine groaned, a deep, terrible sound, as if the mountain itself was waking. The hollow ones reached for him, but they shrank from the flames. Their stolen faces twisted in fury, their whispers turning to desperate, garbled cries. Elias reached the entrance just as the mine gave one last, deafening roar, and then the ceiling collapsed. A cloud of dust and smoke burst into the night air. Elias staggered forward, coughing, gasping. He didn't stop until he was far from the mine, Miriam still in his arms. When he finally looked back, the entrance was gone, buried, sealed. The hollow ones were trapped inside once more. But as he stared at the rubble, a strange thought crept into his mind. For a moment, just a fleeting second, he couldn't remember what color Miriam's eyes were, or if she ever had any. The darkness inside the mine was suffocating, thicker than the fog outside. It clung to Elias's skin, tangled in his hair, even settling in his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. He could hear his breath, sharp and shallow, echoing off the walls as if the mine itself were listening. The whispers had grown louder, and now they weren't just around him. They were inside his mind, crawling through his thoughts, each voice a fragment of a person he once knew. His mother, his father, Miriam, all of them overlapping, pulling him deeper into their hollowing grip. He pushed forward, his lantern's flame barely cutting through the dark. His boots crunched over gravel and bone-dry earth, and his hand tightened around the lantern's handle. He couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, not over the murmurs. The voices, familiar but twisted, spoke his name, but he couldn't tell if they were calling him or warning him. Elias. It was Miriam's voice, but it wasn't. She was close, but the sound of her voice felt distant, as if it was coming from deep inside the mine, from a place that shouldn't be there. He followed it, the desperate need to find her pushing him forward. The tunnel forked up ahead, and the shadows seemed to reach out at him. One path led deeper into the mine, the other toward a chamber he'd never seen before. The air here smelled old, dusty and damp, like something that had been forgotten for too long. "Miriam," he called, his voice cracking in the thick air. The only answer was the hollow echo of his own voice. But there, down the path on the left, a faint flicker of light. He rushed toward it, his heart pounding. The flame from his lantern danced wildly, casting long, twisted shadows against the walls. As he rounded the corner, he saw her. Miriam was sitting on the ground, her eyes wide open but glazed, staring straight ahead. Her face was pale, too pale, almost transparent. Her clothes were torn, and her hair hung in thin strands, as though it was barely holding onto her. She didn't look up when Elias called her name again. "Miriam." He dropped to his knees beside her, grabbing her shoulders, shaking her gently. She blinked, but her gaze was empty. "Elias, you came?" "Yes, I'm here," he whispered, gripping her tighter. "We're getting out of here. We're going home?" But her lips didn't move. Her eyes seemed to flicker, as though she were caught between two worlds. Then a voice, Gideon Holt's voice, rumbled from the shadows. Asterisk, she can't leave, Elias. None of us can, asterisk. Elias turned, his heart skipping a beat. There, standing in the dim light, was Gideon Holt. But he wasn't the man Elias remembered from his childhood. His form was shifting, like smoke or mist, and his eyes were hollow pits that sucked the light from everything around him. You don't have to do this, Elias said, his voice shaking. This isn't you. Let her go. Gideon smiled, but it wasn't a smile. It was the stretch of something darker, an empty expression that held no warmth. You can join us, Elias. We offer you peace. The hunger will stop. You will forget everything. Your memories, your pain. It's the only way. I won't forget, Elias said fiercely. I won't let you take her. I'll stop you. The hollow ones were moving now, shifting in the shadows around him, circling him, whispering his name. He could feel them tugging at his mind, pulling at the edges of his thoughts. He saw flashes, his mother's face, his father's, his old friends from the town, but it was all fading, slipping away like water through his fingers. Miriam, he whispered again, but this time she didn't respond. Gideon's figure grew larger, his voice more insistent. All of you are forgotten, Elias. You can't fight it. Let go, and you will be free. Elias shook his head, desperate. No, I won't be forgotten. The weight of it, the voices, the hunger, was closing in on him. His chest was tight, his breath shallow. The hollow ones were everywhere now, their hands outstretched, trying to pull him into the darkness. In that moment, something broke within him. He remembered his mother's lullaby, the one she sang to him when he was a child. He couldn't remember the words, but he felt them in his chest, a warm, familiar feeling that pushed back the cold of the mine. He grabbed the lantern and, with all his strength, hurled it toward the heart of the chamber. The flames soared through the air, trailing sparks like dying stars, and then it hit the ground and exploded. Fire rushed through the tunnels, filling the space with light and heat. The hollow ones shrieked, their forms flickering like flames caught in the wind. The shadows retreated, burning away, and Gideon's monstrous form shriveled, his screams dissolving into smoke. Elias grabbed Miriam, pulling her to her feet, even as the fire spread. She was limp in his arms, her body light, too light, but he could hear her breath now. Slow, steady, real. The walls of the mine trembled, groaning under the weight of the fire. The hollow ones were fading, swallowed by the flames, their voices dissolving into nothingness. Come on, Elias said, his voice cracking as he pulled Miriam toward the exit. The tunnel behind them collapsed as they ran, the heat of the fire on their backs. Elias couldn't stop. He couldn't look back, not now, not when he knew the shadows would follow him, no matter how far he ran. They burst into the open air just as the mine caved in, and Elias fell to his knees, gasping for breath. Miriam was still in his arms, her face still pale, but now she was breathing, alive, though not quite whole. Elias looked at her, his heart pounding. Was she really there? Was she truly Miriam? Or was she already slipping away, fading like the others? He couldn't be sure. The fire burned in the distance, a blackened scar on the land. He had won for now. But as he stood to leave, a lingering thought gnawed at him. Was this victory enough? In the distance, a shadow stirred, and Elias felt a coldness creep into his chest. The road to Black Hollow was long, and Elias had been traveling for days. The mountains seemed to press in around him, their jagged peaks hidden beneath a constant veil of mist. The world outside the town had a sense of stillness, like a memory that had been left behind. He felt it, too, the unsettling quiet, the hollow absence that seemed to cling to him. Elias had tried to forget. He had left Black Hollow, left the mine, left the whispers, and yet the town lingered in his mind like a dream that would not fade. The faces of the missing, Miriam's fading voice, the hollow emptiness of the town, they gnawed at him as he traveled. He would not let them consume him. He couldn't. He arrived at a small inn late one evening, the kind that sat tucked away in forgotten corners of the world. The building was old, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight, the air thick with the scent of wood and dust. He was exhausted, his mind a fog of half-remembered images. His hands trembled slightly as he paid the innkeeper, a quiet, middle-aged man with sharp eyes, and made his way to his room. The mirror in his room was the first thing he noticed. It hung above a small, worn washstand, the glass reflecting the dim light of the single candle Elias had lit. He paused before it, as though it was something he had forgotten to do. Something important. His reflection was strange. He could not place it at first. His eyes, were they darker? His hair, graying at the edges, looked unfamiliar. And his face, something was missing. He studied himself closer, leaning in until his nose nearly touched the glass. There, the faintest blur at the edges of his features, like the reflection was shifting out of focus. It was unsettling, like looking at someone else, but it was him. It should have been him. He stepped back quickly, a sharp chill running down his spine. The unease was back, that same gnawing feeling he'd carried with him since he left Black Hollow. He tried to dismiss it, just exhaustion, just the strain of everything that had happened. But the thought kept creeping in, persistent as the fog outside the inn window. "Who are you?" The knock at the door startled him. He wiped his face, brushing away the cold sweat that had gathered on his brow, and went to answer it. A traveler stood in the hallway, a man in his late 20s with dark hair and a weary look in his eyes. The man glanced at Elias and then at the nameplate beside the door. "Excuse me," the traveler said, voice hoarse from the road. "Is this Dr. Elias Crow's room?" Elias blinked. The name sounded right, but something about it felt wrong. He stared at the traveler for a long moment, his mouth dry. A moment passed, 2 moments, and the question echoed inside him, louder now. "Who are you?" Finally, he nodded slowly. "Yes," Elias said, though even his own voice sounded strange. "I'm Elias Crow." The traveler's eyes narrowed just slightly. He studied Elias with a curious, probing gaze, like he was trying to place him, too. But the moment passed quickly, and the man smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well," the traveler said, "I was told to find you. The people in Black Hollow. They said you were the doctor, the one who, well, never mind. I just need directions." Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry. He felt the weight of his own name pulling at him, but the words refused to come. "Directions?" he asked, his voice sounding distant, foreign even to him. The traveler looked at him with a mixture of confusion and impatience. "Yes, to Black Hollow." The air in the hallway grew heavier, the walls closing in. Elias felt something stirring in the pit of his stomach, something that told him he should know, should remember, but couldn't. He tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. His head swam. I don't," Elias trailed off, his mind blank. The traveler frowned. "You don't know Black Hollow?" "But you," he paused, eyes flicking to the door, the nameplate. "I was told you were from there." Elias's pulse quickened. He forced himself to speak, but the words felt thick, out of reach. "No," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I don't know. Black Hollow." The traveler blinked. Something passed across his face, something between doubt and pity, and for a moment, he hesitated. Then he nodded slowly, backing away. "Well, never mind, I suppose. Good night, Dr. Crow." The man turned and walked down the hallway, leaving Elias standing at the door, alone in the heavy silence. Elias stepped back inside his room, the mirror still waiting. He looked into it again, but now the reflection was even more distorted. His face seemed farther away, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. His eyes, had lost all recognition, as if they had never been his at all. And then, like the whisper of a forgotten dream, the name came to him. Elias Crow. Who was he? A sharp pain lanced through his mind, a hollow ache where his memories used to be. He felt the pull of something dark and ancient, something that had followed him, something that had been there all along. Black Hollow, the mine, the hollow ones, they were not gone. They were inside him now. They had always been inside him. He turned away from the mirror, a tear slipping down his cheek. But even that felt wrong. It wasn't his. Outside, the mist thickened, and the town settled into its ancient, suffocating quiet. No one would remember Elias Crow. Not in Black Hollow. Not anywhere.